how you work? You look back, Joanne, in your presentation. You kind of did a throwback Thursday, looking at history. How important is history when we write about the future, would you say?
I actually think it comes from a similar impulse. I mean, I'm not a historian, and I wouldn't pretend that I am. My book, Lurking, is filed as history because I was alive when it was happening, and I'm quite old now. So at this point, I have a record of about 30 years of the internet. But there is that sense of the choices that you make to zoom in on, the themes, what you're prioritizing, the point of view. These come into play the same way. And of course, there is that relationship of seeing the trends that have developed over time and developing expectations that they will continue, or perhaps there's something else that threatens this particular aspect that we've taken for granted for so long.
Adrian, would you like to add on to something there?
I mean, when I first got into technology, I was just not interested at all about about history, actually. And I feel like when I was at school, we just never really learned anything other than World War II and how the UK won World War II. You're welcome, everyone. And so I don't think that schools kind of need to go and teach everything. Whenever people go and say schools should teach more about X, Y, Z, I'm like, there's only so many hours in the day. You can't expect schools to teach everything. But I think it's good to be curious. And, I just love reading about how people used to do things. And I think it tells you more about the future than people just pontificating about the metaverse.
Right. I have a question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Marcus from Germany. One question to Adrian. So two questions, basically. On the one hand, what inspired you to fill the list over 3 years? And the second one, did you have to cross off one item because it became true?
That's a good question. So what inspired me? I did it. I launched the book on Kickstarter in 2011. And then people backed it. So then I had to go and write the book. I mean, honestly, it's kind of like a pre-commitment strategy where it's like, well, I got to do it now. I really like writing, and it let me try out lots of different things. And I think I didn't realize that I was signing up to write 100 short stories rather than one book, though. I probably would have done it differently now, because it's just really hard. Are there things that I crossed off? Actually, no, not really. So there's a second edition of the book that came out 2 years ago. And that came out 7 years after the first edition. And I kind of thought, well, I'm going to have to go and cross off the first 10 years of objects. And it turns out I was a little bit too optimistic about things that I thought were going to happen. And so I kept most of those in. So in a lot of ways, technology actually hasn't gone as fast as I thought it would, which is maybe saying something.
Thank you. Question over there.
Yep. Hi, I'm Vaughn, and I think about futures that we don't know about very much yet, right? Like unknown futures. So I have a question for both of you, actually. The Futures Fund instance that, Adrian, you mentioned, they're trying to get people to write stories that are hopeful in the attempt, I assume, to shape the future so it's more like that. Now, what if you were strategically trying to change the way people think about what the future can be with an intentional path in mind? Like, what would you suggest as a strategy for helping people think about futures that make the futures that actually result from that more good in a way that actually does make sense rather than is just what Sam Bankman-Fried wants?
That's a great question. And I think one thing I would point out is that what the Future Fund has done is something that there is a history of organizations who have sponsored actual science fiction writers. And, writers, if you've written a science fiction novel, you might need a little bit of a side income as well. So, yeah, some of them are taking contracts from DARPA and the like. And there are objectives that they have to meet. Now, in certain circumstances, these writers are sometimes the the people who can walk into an organization and tell them to their face, like, this is a problem. We're in the business of writing about problems with technology in the future. But in a lot of cases, the organization itself has the objectives. So these, scenarios or whatever you want to call them, some of them do resemble short stories. Some of them can be very good fiction, but that backing, that there is an objective already. I'm uneasy with this tension because I feel like, because I wrote a science fiction novel, and for anyone to look at me, and this book won't be out for a while, sorry, but eventually when it does, I would hate for anyone to think that like my objective here is to do X and solve Y, because that's not where I come to, even with my nonfiction, that's not how I operate as a writer. That creative spirit is something very different. And yes, I think Kim Stanley Robinson would be a very great example, someone who clearly is on the side of climate justice and writing in ways that are, galvanizing to the public. But I do think I'm uneasy with the current relationships that are in place right now.
Yeah, I would sort of continue on that, and I'd say that I think that you can't really think of fiction as a sort of instrumental tool for, I just don't think it ever really works that well. You mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson, his new book, The Ministry of the Future, for the future, is really popular about climate change. But he's basically been writing the same novel about climate change for the last 30 years, right? And so he's not really doing that because I think he necessarily thinks this is going to change the world, because it actually didn't for 30 years, he's just so persistent. He actually changed my mind, not about climate change, but I was 15 when I read the Red Mars trilogy. And I'm really lucky that I got my politics from that instead of Ayn Rand, right? And so I just became yeah, of course, socialism, that's great. And so the other person who's been really influential to me, I can't believe I only started reading Ursula Le Guin last year. It's kind of embarrassing. The first time I tried to read her, I just bounced off it. And I read The Dispossessed, and I just thought, yeah, I don't think I can justify bosses or billionaires or anything like that anymore. It was so radicalizing. And I don't know that she thought, I'm going to write this book to change the world. I'm not sure. But I think that she did it anyway because she wrote this really interesting story. I will say about The Dispossessed and about Ursula Le Guin is that she kind of does this thing where she tries to create a utopia in the hardest possible situation. And so I feel a lot of science fiction writers kind of cheat by lining up everything so it happens perfectly. And she's okay, but how could we have a utopia where there's actually no resources whatsoever and everyone thinks it sucks, but we're trying to change that. And so I guess, yeah, all of that is to say, I feel the same kind of urge. I was thinking I should go write another novel. I've got the itch again. And I was maybe I should do something about billionaires or something. And then it's best if you try and do that thing where you don't think about it and you try and put it out of your mind as much as possible. And I think that's really hard to do, but you get better results.
Thank you. And now we have time for our last question.
Hey, I'm Dan. Thanks, both of you. That was amazing. I really like this idea of retrospect. Organizations are really bad at post-mortems and so on. Everybody loves a good origin story. And that's, I think, so much science fiction is really optimistic. But have you got any other good examples of sort of looking back at, the other end of the Gartner hype cycle where things went, sour? It goes sort of up and then down and then up again. But you said, now we're experiencing the backlash and we're feeling down about the way social media turned out and people did with a space mission. Do you have any other good examples of that? Because I really like it, but we need more years, right, to get that perspective.
I feel uneasy about pinning anything down, but I think any technology you're going to see some hype cycles that are pretty, pretty classic in terms of the messaging begins a little bit of restating the press releases, then the critics show up, figure out how it works, do what they can to point out the flaws in it. And the reason I feel comfortable speaking about space and social media is because it's kind of out in the world right now. I would feel a little bit more uneasy about, say, other 20th century technologies, the railroads. Like, I don't have a handle on that quite the same. But I think the history of cars is certainly an example that, well, I don't know very well, but I'm walking around Malmo, and that's pretty pleasant. And coming from Boston, which is maybe one of the world's worst cities because of cars. Yeah, like I know that there's a history of people who would protest the highways, and a lot of the underlying issues were about haves and have-nots and how certain highways cut through certain neighborhoods. So like, I really think that any innovation, you're probably going to find those critics that maybe they're not the first to speak because they're not delivering the press releases. But once they find it, I mean, this is what the public is pretty great at, is discovering flaws in it.
Brief summary.
Very brief. Okay, I'm going to give a very quick plug of my next book, which is about gamification. So I think video games are actually, I make video games, and they're basically the most popular form of entertainment, in the world now, especially amongst young people. And we sort of went through a kind of hey, video games are cool and new, and we like them. Then we went through D&D and Doom are going to kill you. And now we're into, actually, games are amazing, and they solve everything. And I'm actually, no, we're going to go down here again now. There are some, as a game designer and as someone who plays a lot of games, there's some things which are problematic about games in terms of being addictive and being overly driven by monetization, and how they're able to kind of control their agency, especially through gamification. So I think it's really difficult for anyone to, forget about games, just any kind of industry, it's difficult to criticize it because people just come out and say you're a hater. And so, you kind of need a bit of thick skin and not care about what people think about you and not get invited to parties for a while, to do that. So that's why you don't hear so much about it.
Thank you, Adrian. And for those who want to hear more from Joanne and Adrian, make sure you grab them. We're going to serve snacks outside. And don't miss our last talk for this year's conference called Endings and New Beginnings by author and food philosopher Magnus Nilsson. It will take place in the Anthill at 4 o'clock. Big hand to Adrian Hahn and Joanne McNeil.